Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today, we're taking a look at a brand new 4K 144Hz gaming monitor from MSI that's designed to be on the more affordable end of the scale. It's the MAG 274 UPF that we first saw at Computex just a few months ago, and it appears to be the successor to the popular MAG 281 URF that we looked at last year. On the spec sheet, this 274 UPF is pretty similar to the 281 URF. 4K resolution, 144Hz maximum refresh rate, IPS panel technology, adaptive sync support, HDMI 2.1, display HDR 400 certification without any real HDR hardware. The only obvious difference is the panel size, dropping from 28 inches to 27 inches, which is a negligible difference in the grand scheme of things. But this does mean the new 274 UPF model uses a different panel, swapping out the older Innolux panel for a unit from BOE. We'll see how that affects performance throughout the review. The UPF is also debuting with a new price tag of $600 US, down from the $700 MSRP of the previous model at launch. At first glance, that appears to be pretty good price movement. New model debuting at $100 less than the old model, that sounds decent. But monitor pricing is usually pretty fluid, and these days the MAG 281 URF can be found for around $600 or even less at times. So the new 27-inch model is going to have to do more than just feature an attractive price to get our recommendation. When we look at the design, this is very much an MSI monitor with the same aesthetic we've seen now across a range of their displays. As this isn't a super high-end model, there's no RGB LED lighting here, which is only a good thing in my opinion, but it also brings about a pretty basic use of materials. Black plastic is used all around here, and there's a few gamerish design elements on the rear. I don't think it looks bad, but I also don't think it's an especially premium design either, given you get a slight variation to this when buying a display that's half the price. There are a few positives here though. The stand is well designed and highly adjustable, supporting all of height, tilt, swivel and pivot adjustment with a good range of motion and acceptable stability. I also appreciate the relatively small stand base, which doesn't waste a ton of desk space. The port selection includes one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, two HDMI 2.1 ports, and a USB-C port that supports DP Alt mode and 65 watts of power delivery, decent for hooking this up to a laptop via a single cable. In addition, we get a simple 2-port USB hub. The HDMI 2.1 ports are 48 gigabits per second, so they will have the best compatibility with input devices and of course run at 144 Hz. The OSD is controlled through a directional toggle on the rear of the monitor, and it includes the standard functionality we've seen from many MSI monitors so far. This means we're getting crosshairs, shadow boosting, sniper mode, various color modes and color controls, as well as a KVM switch. I really like the increased usage of KVMs in gaming monitors. That's a genuinely useful addition to the feature set. For motion and performance, the 274 UPF includes 3 overdrive settings, the first of which is the normal mode, which appears to show overdrive off behavior. Native panel performance is around the 10 millisecond range with 0 overshoot, and while 10 milliseconds sounds rather slow, cumulative deviation of 600 isn't awful, but of course, we can do better. The fast mode though is only a small improvement on the normal mode, reducing the average response and cumulative deviation slightly. This does lead to an overshoot-free experience, though I would have liked to see a more significant difference to the normal mode. One of the primary reasons for this is that the faster mode, the top overdrive setting, is drastically different to normal, and while it does improve the average response to 3.21 milliseconds, it introduces noticeable inverse ghosting with a very high 75% inverse ghosting rate. Most gamers won't want to use this setting due to the ugly artifacts it introduces. So when we're discussing overdrive settings, there are really only 2 viable settings, one of which is equivalent to no overdrive, and the other is only a minor improvement on that. For the best optimization, I really would have liked to see a mode in between fast and faster that ideally would have delivered the best experience this panel could offer. Either that or user adjustable overdrive, which we've seen on a handful of other displays. As it stands, the best mode is the fast mode, which isn't especially fast at 144 Hz and falls short of a proper 144 Hz experience due to its low refresh compliance. This level of performance is more in line with a 100 to 120 Hz panel. The good news is that as we move down the refresh rate range, performance is largely unchanged, so for variable refresh rate gamers you won't see any inverse ghosting artifacts even way down at 60 Hz. Overshoot does increase slightly at these lower refresh rates, but not to any significant degree, and certainly in that sub 100 Hz range the experience is pretty good. What we're left with is a situation where the 274 UPF does offer a single overdrive mode experience, but only by default, and it sacrifices good performance at the highest refresh rates to achieve this. Variable refresh gamers should opt for the fast mode here. Unfortunately, this leaves the 274 UPF in a rather poor position when we compare it to other 4K gaming monitors at the highest refresh rate on offer. MSI have not done a ton of optimization here for the highest refresh rate users, and while the level of overshoot is low, it doesn't compare favorably to say the Lenovo Y32P30 or even something like the Sony InZone M9, which has little to no inverse ghosting. MSI's predecessor, the MAG 281 URF, is a lot faster, and the level of overshoot from that panel is manageable, though higher than the new model. It's only at the highest refresh rate though, where the 274 UPF is especially poor. Looking on average across the refresh rate range, it's still not a particularly fast monitor, but having no overshoot issues is an advantage. For example, the 281 URF is around 4.7 milliseconds faster on average than the 274 UPF, but it achieves this with a much higher inverse ghosting rate of 28%. Meanwhile, some of the products we've really liked in the past, like the LG 27GP950, are just 17% faster. It's still not an amazing result and could definitely be tuned better, but it's not as disastrous as the 144Hz numbers would suggest. This is really highlighted when looking at cumulative deviation, which quantifies the balance between speed and overshoot. Previously, we saw the older 281 URF having a 2x response time advantage over the 274 UPF with significantly more overshoot. In cumulative deviation terms, that balances out to an 11% advantage in favor of the 281 URF. While the overall result still places the new 274 UPF model lower down in the chart, it's not significantly different to most other 4K models, but it's still important to be aware that this is an average result across all the refresh rates tested. The 281 URF is 30% better in cumulative deviation at 144Hz, a more notable advantage, but this swings to being 11% in favor of the 274 UPF at 60Hz. So which of these models is best may come down to the sorts of refresh rates you plan on using. At a fixed 120Hz, the 274 UPF is not a particularly compelling display. Again, this is more towards the top end of the refresh rate range, where this MSI model is not well optimized. At 60Hz, the results are more favorable thanks to the low level of overshoot achieved here in comparison to some other displays that have much higher inverse ghosting rates at 60Hz. That balances out nicely for this model. Like previous models, MSI do support backlight strobing on this monitor through their MPRT setting, though this is not MPRT sync, so strobing and adaptive sync can't be used simultaneously, a feature regression compared to the 281 model that did support MPRT sync. Visually, I found the new 274 model to be a bit clearer in its strobed mode than the 281, but there are still artifacts like red fringing and other annoyances like the inability to adjust panel brightness in this mode. Due to this, I think most gamers will prefer to use the panel without strobing enabled, and certainly the quality here isn't convincing enough to be a full-time setting like you might see on the best esports monitors. Input lag is great, reporting in at under 1 millisecond of processing delay, which is similar to most other 4K 144Hz gaming monitors on the market. We're yet to see many 4K 240Hz monitors, especially in this sort of price range, so for now, this is a typical latency experience that's mostly impacted by slow response times at the max refresh rate. Power consumption is excellent, and this is one of the areas where the new BOE panel combination is able to outperform the previous Innolux unit. The 274 UPF uses just 25 watts to display a 200 nit full screen white image compared to 38 watts for the MAG 281 URF and other models that use that same panel. That's a 36% reduction in power consumption, which, yeah, is only 13 watts, but if you use the monitor for 5 hours a day, every day, you'll end up saving 24 kilowatt hours of energy per year, which, is reasonable. The 274 UPF is a wide gamut monitor sporting 96% coverage of DCI-P3, and this is another area where the new BOE panel is better than the old Innolux variant, which hit 94% coverage. Not a huge difference, but it does lead to 74% coverage of Rec 2020 compared to 69% previously, so that's a small but notable bump that gets this model closer to the models that use an LG panel like the 27GP950. As for factory calibration, well, grayscale performance is quite decent with a flat and near accurate CCT curve, great gamma performance, and a resulting low delta E. But like with a lot of wide gamut gaming monitors, the 274 UPF ships without an sRGB clamp enabled by default. So when viewing regular SDR content like YouTube videos, there will be some oversaturation, which is shown here by raised delta E averages. When we compare this to other monitors, factory grayscale performance is excellent and significantly better than the old 281 URF, now matching the Gigabyte M28U. However, color checker is mid-table. MSI do include an sRGB mode, which provides a simple setting to limit the color space to sRGB for SDR content. Unfortunately, important controls are locked in this mode, like white balance, so it's not perfect. And disappointingly, MSI adjusts the grayscale performance in this mode, which makes it worse than the default mode for some bizarre reason. This mode would be a lot better if grayscale performance was the same, but it's not, with worse delta E's and color temperature. However, the sRGB gamut clamping is quite effective, and although it is limited somewhat by that grayscale performance, delta E's here are average. When we compare the sRGB mode to other monitors, grayscale performance is below average. It would have been near the top of the chart if performance remained identical to the default mode. Color checker performance is average here, not as good as the Gigabyte M28U, but better than the 281 URF. The best way to improve the 274 UPF's performance is through a full calibration, which we performed using CalMan. We get very good results for regular SDR content like most gaming monitors that fully cover that color space, and thanks to 96% DCI-P3 coverage, we also see good results there. Not quite full coverage, which some color professionals may desire, but it's pretty good. The 274 UPF gets much brighter than its predecessor for SDR content, which is good news as the MAG 281 URF wasn't especially bright. I think 272 nits would have been fine for a lot of users, but it's nowhere near as good as the 521 nits the new model is capable of. So if you desire a high brightness experience, the 274 UPF is the way to go as it sits among the brightest displays in this chart. The downside is that the minimum brightness is not very good at just 119 nits. For the dimmest environments, something like the Gigabyte M28U at 39 nits is preferable. For contrast ratio, the 274 UPF is fine, reporting in at near 1100 to 1, which is pretty typical these days from an IPS panel. It is slightly better than the MAG 281 URF, but not to a noticeable degree, and naturally it falls well short of VA panels and OLEDs. Black levels remain poor on IPS monitors overall, so if you want the highest contrast experience, unfortunately you won't get that here, but among IPS LCDs this isn't bad or anything. Viewing angles, pretty good, like we see from most modern IPS panels, and much better than a VA or TN. Uniformity though was average. The center section was reasonably consistent, but there was a bit of fall off around the outer edges, including some slight tone differences. Not enough to be distracting or anything like that, just not among the best panels I've seen. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. MSI gets off to a good start, accurately advertising HDMI 2.1 capabilities and even underselling the brightness capabilities, listing just 400 nits versus the over 500 nits that I recorded. P3 color space coverage was only a borderline result, and there are some sRGB mode limitations. The main issue with this display is motion performance. Advertising a 1 millisecond response time is quite misleading given the performance we saw, which also didn't produce acceptable refresh compliance. HDR is also advertised, but realistically this panel is only capable of fake HDR as it has no local dimming capabilities, weak brightness and terrible contrast. But in the issues and defects section, MSI sails through with a clean bill of health and even supports firmware updates, so theoretically something like response times could be tuned via a firmware update. Unfortunately, MSI software invites you to install Norton 360 multiple times, which is pretty annoying, so that does, I guess, detract a little bit from the firmware update support through their software utility, but at least the important thing, the firmware updates, is supported here. Overall, the MSI MAG 274 UPF ends up as a bit of a mixed bag. There are some quite decent improvements here compared to its predecessor and other value-oriented 4K 144Hz gaming monitors, but also some disappointing areas to performance. It's not the all-round improvement I was hoping for, despite maintaining a relatively okay price. What I like about this display is the BOE panel itself. There are some signs here that this panel is an improvement over the Innolux unit we saw in many previous generation affordable 4K gaming monitors. The 274 UPF is much brighter and consumes less power than MSI's predecessor, the MAG 281 URF, and packs a slightly wider color gamut and slightly better contrast ratio. Despite the launch MSRP dropping by $100 US, the actual panel quality seems very good and not just a cut down variant of what we saw last year. Where MSI have fumbled is with motion performance. The 274 UPF is not especially well tuned, particularly for gaming at the maximum 144Hz refresh rate or near to it. Your choices are either a slow but overshoot free experience or a fast but artifact riddled experience, and while this does deliver a good experience in the mid to low refresh rate range, it's just not that compelling overall. With such a limited range of overdrive options, I think this panel could have provided more than what MSI are giving us. With that said, motion performance is not disastrous, and at the end of the day, if you're expecting to mostly play in the 60 to 100 FPS range, the 274 UPF is quite similar to many of its competitors. It's only right up near 144Hz where products like the M28U and MAG 281 URF perform notably better. At its current price tag of $600 US, the 274 UPF is difficult to recommend. While this is down $100 on last gen models at launch, the MAG 281 URF has regularly been seen around $580 to $600 US this year, and more recently at a crazy good $520. The Gigabyte M28U is another similar product, priced typically around $550 with lows near $500. With a mixture of improvements and regressions compared to these two monitors, I find it hard to recommend paying a premium for the newer 274 UPF. It just doesn't do enough to justify that price, and you'd be better off buying the old model at a discount. I also found the eventual $600 MSRP a bit surprising given MSI told me this monitor would be $550 at Computex, so possibly it received a last minute price increase. $550 would be a lot better, $500 the perfect price, but at $550 you could make a case for it. I expect that like with the MAG 281 URF, the 274 UPF will eventually drop to $550 and even $500 over time, at which point it would be worth considering, though not exactly a must-buy product. There is certainly a lot of competition in the monitor market, and even a $50 price change can make a big difference. And that's it for this review of this MSI 4K 144Hz gaming monitor. If you're interested in this product or any of the others that we've been talking about throughout this review, we do have links in the description below to them where you can check their prices or buy them, that sort of thing. If you do want to support the channel, then subscribing is a great way to do that. Subscribe to Mindless Unboxed, give the video a like, and also sign up to our Patreon or Floatplane accounts. Links to those are in the description below. You get access to things like our ICC profiles, our behind the scenes videos, Discord chat, lots of great stuff there. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.